As we at the Colson Center like to say, redemption is always personal, but it's never private. When we are restored in Christ, God gives us a work of restoration to do in the world. But no Christian is called to do that work alone. That's why we seek to build strategic partnerships with like-minded Christian organizations, like Focus on the Family, the Association of Christian Schools International, and more, to bring comprehensive worldview training to believers in every context, from Fortune 500 companies to middle school history classrooms. As we approach the end of our fiscal year, we need your help to continue strengthening our partnerships and bringing worldview training to more believers than ever. To partner with us in equipping Christians everywhere to live out their faith wherever God calls them, give today at colsoncenter.org/FYE23. Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. With me today is Kasey Leander. We're talking about my conversation with Dr. Jeremy Begbie about the mystery of music and what it has to do with theology. Kasey, this was an episode that I have been trying to get to for over a year, ever since our colleague Heather Peterson introduced me to Jeremy Begbie's work through some YouTube videos. And I can't believe I'd never heard of this guy, because he is like the music OG. When it comes to relating theology to music, I feel like there's always this kind of vague sense that they have something to do with each other and that music is revelatory in some way, but nobody ever has specifics. Well, Dr. Begbie has specifics, and he's written book after book about it. So, man, was it rich. And I got to tell you, we didn't even get to like a fraction of the stuff that he covers in his book in this short conversation.
Yeah, what a gem. This was such a fun one to listen to. So I'm excited to be on and just have the follow-up conversation, because, yeah, it was a delight to listen to this episode.
Are you a musician, out of curiosity? Do you play any instruments?
When you go out on a limb and say, yes, I am a musician, that comes with a lot of expectation. So I just say, I do play piano and I do play guitar. So, and I had an amazing teacher through childhood. He was like an R&B legend. So by the name of Tom Beard. So for his sake, I would say yes.
I feel like I have a strong appreciation for music, but I adamantly declaim the title musician. I took some piano lessons and that's about it. But I just have this very keen appreciation for it. And I married a piano teacher. So my wife's degree is in music instruction. And so she's always telling me about, the specifics of this and that. And she butters me up and says, I have a good ear for this stuff too. But it's something that I guess in many ways you sort of intuit things about it, but then you need somebody who understands the technical language to tell you what the heck it is you're talking about. Like, that thing in music where they do the, and what's that called? And Gabby could do, she could be the Jeremy Begbie. She could do like, that's called an appoggiatura. It's some Italian term, right? I remember I was actually an art teacher years ago, told me, okay, when they were doing all the music and art in Europe, I guess in the Renaissance, they kind of came to this settlement where they were like, all right, Italians, you get to be the language of music, and French, you get to be the language of art. And that's how everything is going to work out. And you see that it really does. Every musical term is like Italian and every artistic term is French.
Wow. I'd never noticed that. It's probably from one like concordance they had where they sat down in a secret room and decided that.
But that's the thing about having a conversation like this, when you're talking with someone who's such a musical genius, who spent his life as a music educator, but who also has a keen theological knowledge. In fact, Dr. Begbie considers himself first and foremost a theologian, and then secondarily someone who translates theology into music, or who brings the wisdom of music into theology. So it's like I'm trying to keep up with what he's saying, but as he explains it, and particularly as he demonstrates it behind a piano, which you can find all over YouTube. Like we played a couple of clips in the podcast, but when he does that, you really get the sense for what he's telling you, because the magic of music, part of the magic of music, is that you don't have to be a master of music theory to understand the sound of it, to receive and participate in what it's doing in you. And in his book, Theology, Music, and Time in particular, he raises these just fascinating suggestions about how music is experienced physically as almost like a temporal bodily rhythm. And he relates it to the bodily rhythms that we experience constantly, subconsciously, the physiology that keeps us alive, like our breathing and our heartbeat, our pulse, our blinking, things like that, just our waking and sleeping cycles. We have all these almost like sinusoidal rhythmical cycles that characterize human life, and music gets based off of those to even where the point, like the second. What is the basis of the second in timekeeping? Well, it turns out that's about the average heartbeat, resting heart rate, right? So that's why we perceive seconds that way. And that rhythm becomes ingrained into music. And so, I mean, yeah, music, and that we can go down that whole rabbit hole, but it's like audible participation in time. And so we get it. We understand it. Even if you've never studied and if you can't read music or play an instrument, it can move you deeply because it's like an innately human thing.
It's also the ultimate left brain, right brain thing. Like you bringing up your wife's piano skills reminded me of my wife, who is exceptional at reading music. I've never been able to do that with ease, but I can hear music pretty well and play along. And somehow we're both partaking in like completely different aspects of music, right? It's a very structured, mathematical discipline. And it's also like completely free flowing, and you do what strikes you. And I don't know if there's a better example of where those two ways of thinking or personality preferences intersect with so much vigor as music. It really, like, that's why a music theologian makes sense to me, is that it uses like every part of the brain.
It's very similar to the relationship between systematic and biblical theology. So biblical theology tends to lean on literary skills, the ability to read a text and pick up on references and plants and payoff and echoes and foreshadowing and typology and stuff like that. Things that you would read like the Odyssey or the Iliad and say, we can pick up on these themes, right? But then on the systematic side of things, it uses the vocabulary of philosophy, which has a very mathematical, systematic character to it. I mean, it literally goes into the name, systematic theology, right? Which is another way of saying dogmatic theology. And you use these categories, and it's a very left-brained kind of approach to things. And those two areas mesh together because biblical and systematic theology inform one another. Music it's kind of the same thing. I mean, you can look at it on a page written down in terms of notation, although Dr. Begbie is really careful to avoid in his books the suggestion that you can hold up a piece of paper and be like, this is the music. This is just the music. He says, no, the music is performed in time. It's ephemeral. It only exists for the short moment it's being played and experienced. That paper is just a reminder or a notation that helps you to recreate that experience of the real thing, which is the music. But those two things meet because you got that mathematical precision that can be recreated with reliable accuracy. And then you've got that artistic side, the subjective experience of it, the sense of what music does in each individual heart and mind and to each set of ears that it encounters, and it moves you in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily, this is one thing he contrasts it with language. It doesn't necessarily denote things in a concrete, straightforward way. Like you can't use music to say, this is a table, but you can use music to say something about we won't say a table, but a character in a story or a situation or a moment of celebration or mourning or any of the whole range of human emotions that you can't say with words. So it's a whole different thing. You can't analogize it to words, but you can use it to say some things about stories or statements or theology, which is really just stories and statements about God.
Yeah, man, in my life, that's been such a huge breakthrough for me, Shane. Just realizing that art is about things. On one hand, it really is about immediate and visceral and highly subjective things. So like, wow, those columns on the US Capitol building sure are grand. Like you can't help it. It's going to strike you. On the other hand, it's telling a deep story. Like if you know the history, you know that we're mimicking Greco-Roman designs because we see ourselves as inheriting Republic from those sources, right? And so like the deeper in you go, art is about things. And the same can be said of music. To me, that's been like the breakthrough of a lifetime. Like even realizing, I remember as a kid, we would go to the Denver Art Museum on a field trip. and you just walk in and you like some, you don't like others. And as a kid, I just thought postmodern art is ridiculous. Like I could do that. I think every single person has that thought at some point. Why is this Picasso selling for, $20 million? I could spill some paint and do the same thing. And the truth is you could, but it doesn't completely justify it, but it helps make a little more sense if you realize art is about something. And Picasso, as much as he was an artist, was also a philosopher. And his art is philosophy in visual form. He's commenting on the chaos and meaninglessness, seemingly, of the world, right? Like there's all kinds of themes. You want to be careful. You want to approach with a light touch and do good like cultural exegesis. You want to find out what the artists are trying to do and what they're not trying to do. You want to extract, distilled essence of meaning from their piece. But there's still correlation there. Art is about something.
Music in particular, as a form of art, seems like it resists much more strongly than visual art, like painting and sculpture, this drive to subjectivize it, to divorce it from the thing which it is about, or from objective meaning. And so if you make a sculpture that looks like, it's just kind of formless, it doesn't really correspond to anything in the world. It's just sort of an expression of shape. Or a painting that's just an expression of color, kind of the Jackson Pollock thing, right? And apologies if there's some big Jackson Pollock defender out there, but I look at that stuff and I don't think, wow, that's an amazing artistic achievement. I look at it and be like, yeah, that's literally just the kind of thing you could have achieved by spilling paint. Again, maybe that just shows how uncultured I am. But I think I have Roger Scruton on my side, so I'll be okay there. I've got some highbrow, curmudgeonly conservative art critics, but music, you notice, if you try to do the musical equivalent of a Jackson Pollock painting, I don't think anybody would listen to it. And there have been attempts, I know, to do sort of a postmodern music, right? So you do cacophony or lots of dissonance, autonal stuff. That was popular for a while. It's kind of fallen out of favor lately, but you hear a lot of that kind of music, or even weird stuff like that. There was like a symphony where they just did silence, if you remember that.
John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds.
Okay, right. And in principle, silence is very important, but there's no actual order there. There's nothing that has been created. It's just like painting a wall brown, Great. Brown is a color you can use in a real painting, but all you've done is paint the wall brown, right? Or I guess you can compare it to a blank canvas, right? There's nothing there. There are certain places in the canvas you would want to remain blank or white, but musically speaking, silence is that blank canvas, and you have to use it selectively. You can't just plop it down and say, this is art. But that's what a lot of people have tried to do. And I notice that's not very popular because music resists that very strongly. I think back on that great passage in the Screwtape Letters where Screwtape is about to lose it and turn into a giant centipede, right? He's super angry at Wormwood. And I'll just read the excerpt because it's a marvelous moment where Lewis gets to the heart of, I guess, music's correspondence to meaning and to the good. He says, "Music and silence, how I detest them both. How thankful we should be that ever since our father entered hell, though longer ago than humans, reckoning in light years, could express, no square inch of infernal space and no moment of infernal time has been surrendered to either of those abominable forces, but all has been occupied by noise. Noise, the grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. Noise, which alone defends us from silly qualms, despairing scruples, and impossible desires. We will make the whole universe a noise in the end. We have already made great strides in this direction as regards the earth. The melodies and silences of heaven will be shouted down in the end." And so demonic cacophony literally means like evil sound. And that's what the demons want to make. The whole of reality is a cacophony. But music and silence, kind of playing off of one another, evince this order that the forces of darkness actually hate. And I can't help but notice how music resists that drive into total subjectivism, into total cacophony or dissonance in a way that visual art seems like it doesn't quite do.
Man, there's so much there, Shane. I'm just chewing up, like thoughts are racing through my mind. I mean, to what you're saying about absence or silence being a powerful means. I was just in Israel, actually. I was at Yad Vashem, which is their Holocaust Museum. And at the very end of that experience, you go to, it's like a cone. It's like a massive cone shape. And in the ground, they've dug just a pit that goes into the like tan looking rocks that Jerusalem is built on. It's just a huge pit. And above you, you see the memorialized names of people who died in the Holocaust. And their point there is that there's an absence. There's a gaping hole. We are not going to be able to fill this. Like this museum, it's almost like the statement saying like, this museum can't do it justice. It's incredibly moving to see it. But you're so right. Like, and like C.S. Lewis's point, that absence is not the same as chaos. It actually is there to mean something. So like you could make the argument that like John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds is profound because it's saying something. I'm not well versed enough to know what it's saying, but we'll never be able to escape meaning. That's the fact. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, the big question I was going to ask Shane is, what about music is truly universal as opposed to just being subjective? Like, what is it about music that is truly universal? And maybe one thing we could say is that it means something. Maybe here, tell me what you think about this definition of music. It's always created on purpose.
I guess you could define music as order, oral order that corresponds in some way to objective rules about how sound functions and the way it affects human experience, the way it is expressive of human experience, because we're creatures with voices, and there are certain universal aspects of our voices. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for someone who hasn't really studied music in any sort of formal setting, like me, right? I haven't studied this stuff formally. I've just sort of had conversations and read books. One of the things you realize that Dr. Begbie brings out is that Western music, Western tonal music, which is what we're familiar with, right? It's sort of a recent thing and a time-bound and space-bound thing. It exists. It came into existence within the last 500 years and came into its own and then started spreading within the last 500 years. And Western tonal music has certain distinctives that are not universal to all other types of music. So, the steps that it takes, the intervals between notes, that's a function of Western tonal music. It's not universal. A lot of prior music and music to this day around the world has much more fine-grained distinctions between notes. So it doesn't just step up and down the same way that Western music does. It like on a piano, there's notes between the notes, as you could say. So that's one thing. And then another thing is like the tension resolution pattern that he brings out with Western music. It's story shaped. It's like an oral hero's journey. There's a home, away, home again structure. It's almost like a there and back again, like The Hobbit is built into Western tonal music. It tells that story. And he says that the classical and then Christian consciousness shaped that profoundly. Death, burial, and resurrection shaped that profoundly, which is a claim that I've heard Glenn Sunshine, colleague of ours, make before. And I didn't fully understand it until I started reading Begbie's stuff. But there is something, he does defend the idea that there's something universal to music and that Western music is not arbitrary, that it actually has discovered and tapped into principles of reality that are not sort of up for grabs or that are not open to interpretation, so to speak. So like the way the harmonics work between different notes, the way chords are built, they actually, if you were to look at the waves and how they correspond to one another and the intervals between waves, you would see that certain frequencies actually sound good together because they actually have a definable mathematic relationship, right? Dissonance looks like a sort of clashing of the sound waves, whereas the harmony looks like a perfect complementing of the sound waves. And so there really is something there, and Western music really is taking advantage of it, but it's not the only game in town. It's not the only way to do things. That helps, especially when we're defining music and trying to find what you said, something universal about it.
Do you think, because I hear what you're saying, and to the extent we're talking about the Christian story, and that's what we mean by Western music, then there is something very specific that is absolutely true about reality in that. But I'm just wondering, Shane, like, do you think it's fair to say that all music taps into those sort of like universal, like non-negotiables of sound, in the sense that because it's recognizably music, they're at least playing on those themes of tension and dissonance, right? Like it's almost the question of what's universal in the human heart versus how wide can we range subjectively with like language, for example. Like language definitely shapes the boundaries of what we think is possible and like different words. Like, I don't know why I'm thinking of my grandma who grew up German Mennonite, and she has such a creative vocabulary from that. Like they had lots of like somewhat rude slang. It was kind of the Creole of German, but language is broad and it feels subjective, and yet it's anchored in certain universals as well, right? So when you say Western tonal music, I guess it makes me raise that question again, because I guess one money question would be, do we think then that Western tonal music is better?
That's something I've always talked about with Gabby. She's kind of a Roger Scruton-esque, Western-centric Christian triumphalist. I mean, she really does unapologetically say, yes, this is the best civilization and the best stuff has emerged from it because of the Christian influence, and we don't have to apologize for that. So I think it's the stance that a lot of people would have taken before very recent modern times introduced this relativistic impulse in us to say that all cultures are basically the same, which is not to say you don't appreciate them. But to your question, there are advances that have been made in Western music that I think are comparable to the advances that were made in mathematics, by someone like Isaac Newton. Calculus is not a Western way of doing things. It's literally a discovery of part of how reality works, how numbers work, how space and number interact, and how you can make precise calculations with those things. Like those are the principles of calculus they're not arbitrary. And I think to a great extent, the principles of music, Western music, are not arbitrary. Now, Western music is probably a distillation of some things. And this is just me speaking as a layman and who's really interested in how this all works and why it affects us the way it does and how it's related to theology, right? And anthropology and what it means to be human and what God has put into us, these desires. But I think Western music distills certain principles of music, but it's by no means exhaustive of music. So I'm going to direct you to, if you're listening to this, check out, there's an article at The Conversation. It's called Ancient Greek Music. Now we finally know what it sounded like. And it's this group of Oxford scholars a few years ago who reconstructed ancient Greek music about 400 BC. And it has a couple of YouTube videos in there. There's one that's about 15 minutes long. And it has this beautiful reconstruction of what from the Homeric epics to inscriptions around the Oracle of Delphi, where these things would be sung. So it's poetry, and all Greek poetry of this era would essentially be sung. And what it illustrates when you hear this plausible, well-researched reconstruction of what ancient music sounded like before Christianity, before the West as we know it even began to emerge in seed form, right? This is like the time of Plato and Aristotle. And you listen to it, the quality of this music is it feels organic, it feels human, it feels vocal. So whereas Western music is like, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, it's got that really familiar kind of, it's very specific and tonal. This stuff is like, it sounds like someone singing. Even the instruments sound like someone singing or speaking. And you can imagine it emerging from like a bard around a fire going, now let me tell you the story of. This is
beautiful, Shane, by the way. I'm just enjoying every second of you singing on this podcast.
I'm just trying to get the point of, sorry, folks. I think what I'm trying to do here is illustrate this transition that takes place where you can imagine how someone just melodically reciting poetry in rhythm begins to evolve in the direction of something we would recognize as music. And then it gets set in these traditional oral forms that are passed down, not with written sheet music. So no one's reading sheet music, although they do say that the words themselves have certain, like you can get the meter from those. And then there's markers on the Greek letters that approximate the tone or the pitch that they'd be using there. So they're able to reconstruct with some reliability. Oh, and then they've found the instruments. The archaeologists have found the instruments. And so they know exactly which notes the instruments could and could not hit. So they replicate the instruments and boom, you're off to the races. You can actually hear Greek music at that point. But it's very different. It's not like, playing a piano or even playing a violin. It's it has a different quality to it. And I guess it's an embryonic quality too, because you couldn't do the same stuff you can do with Western tonal music.
It's so interesting. I mean, again, my mind is just like sprinting in a bunch of different directions. I think one thing for my part, I want to be careful throwing around the word Western, because I think some people could hear that and say, oh yeah, America or England forever, or whatever, like Europe. It's a tension we wrestle with in our faith. It's the universality versus the particularity. Scripture teaches certain universals. From the beginning of the world, God's existence has been made obvious to everyone. And part of the imago Dei is that we live in a world with meaning and morality, and we're all trying to answer those questions. I don't care who you are. If you're from a deeply Eastern tradition, you are wrestling with your answer to what is wrong with the world. And your answer might be, there's nothing, because suffering and evil are an illusion. We need to see through that illusion. You're still grappling with the question. And then Christianity also introduces a particularism in the sense that God just chose the Jewish people. Why? For his own purposes. It's not because they're better or more numerous. The Old Testament is really clear to remind us again and again and again. It's not because they were even I would argue, aesthetically superior. It's just because that's how God chose to do it. He chose to weave his story of salvation into one particular culture. And so what does that do? I think what it doesn't do is say Jewish culture is inherently superior, but it does create certain moral imperatives. For example, we need to pay attention to ancient Hebrew culture if we're going to understand the truth about God better. It's there's a particularism where we need to do good scholarship on what the ancient Jewish mind thought of when they received these scriptures. So what that does, in essence, is give us something to hold on to that rescues us from a temptation to relativism that universalism can bring us to. Yeah, I don't know. There's another critique of elevating Western thought specifically that doesn't come from a place of relativism, but rather moral clarity, that actually the Lord doesn't elevate the aesthetics of culture quite like that. He does elevate the practices of culture, a culture that kills its babies is worse than a culture that doesn't, right? But I don't think Scripture, tell me what you think of this, I don't think it elevates the aesthetics to quite that same level.
So the analogy that I drew at the beginning of my discussion with Dr. Begbie was the analogy between science and music. So the why then, why there question with regard to science. And this is something I didn't actually know until the last couple of years, reading books about the origin of science, particularly Glenn Scrivener's The Air We Breathe, and then Stephen Meyer's The Return of the God Hypothesis. And both of these books do a great job illustrating how the scientific method or set of scientific methods that we know today, the commitment to observation, experimentation, repetition of the experiment, and then abductive inferences based on the experiments, that methodology, that reliance on evidence rather than conjecture, or abduction and inference instead of deduction from assumed universal principles, which is kind of the Greek way of doing science, the ancient Greek way, that emerges only in the Christian West. And they just exhaustively document this. Nobody else came up with this idea that, hey, if we want to know how the world works, we got to go out there and observe how it works. And then as we begin to observe patterns, we can then make generalizations based on those particular observations, right? Because we assume that the world is essentially consistent, it's not capricious. What we see is the result of ordered principles built into it, or laws given us by a lawmaker, a legislator, divine legislator, as opposed to the unpredictable, capricious actions of a variety of deities. That's just one principle. There are a number of key principles that the scientific method is actually built on, and they make the case that these only emerge out of the Christian West for solid worldview reasons. Like nobody in China would be the prime alternative candidate for a civilization in which science emerges, because it's oldest and it has it's older and it had this long stability that almost no civilization had. Just dynasty after dynasty after dynasty of essentially stable civilization. They invent gunpowder, and then for some reason they don't invent modern science. Why is that? And the answer appears to be that Christianity furnished certain worldview principles that Chinese philosophy and then eventually Confucianism and Buddhism did not furnish. Now, I think there's an analogy with music, and that this is where we could potentially get in some trouble, but it's a defense of the idea that Western music actually is a more advanced form of music than what you see typically throughout the world and elsewhere. And why did it emerge in the Christian West only? Well, I think it's because of underlying assumptions about the way things are that have their origins in Christianity. And you get that precisely because the world is viewed in a certain way, with certain order, with certain purpose. And it's viewed, well, the world itself is viewed teleologically and Christotelically. So it has a purpose, and the purpose is bound up in the person of Christ, right? So that's where you get, this is conjecture, but I think it's supported conjecture. This is where you get the emergence of a death, burial, and resurrection pattern, of a tension and resolution pattern, of a home, away, and home again pattern in Western music that Begbie's talking about, because we have the gospel actually underlying the very substance of it. And if it's true that the God who we meet in Christ is the God who created the universe, then we should expect that God and his story to unlock certain principles of reality and actually give us the ability to advance beyond ancient forms. So that's my defense for the idea that there actually is an analogy between Western music and Western science, and that it has reached a pinnacle precisely because of Christianity.
So fascinating. And to be honest, Shane, I don't know where I land on that particular premise. It reminds me of this raging debate I had back in the 8th grade with one of my 8th grade teachers.
Those are when the best raging debates happen, man.
Oh, man. I would have hated to have me in class. I was I was going through like an angsty, 2000, like mid 2000s, like emo phase. Despite being a thoroughly homeschooled, Christian Adventures in Odyssey kid, I also was like, but I own a skateboard and I have a hoodie and I listen to some metal. And I had a teacher in 8th grade who was like, metal can't glorify God. Like, she was just like plain and simple, like screamo music cannot glorify God. And
it was Christian metal though, right?
It was.
Okay. All right.
In my 8th grade mentality, I was like, no, it can. And it does. And through many mountains and valleys, I actually, all right, now like cards on the table, I actually think there's a version of that does glorify God. What do you make of that? How far are you willing to take the aesthetic superiority of like certain chords and tones?
Okay, so I've never enjoyed that genre or listened to it that much. It's just kind of annoying to me.
As it is to me now. Let me be clear for our listeners.
I recognize that there is an aesthetic element there that is subjective, and that it's not like it's not an on or off kind of thing. It's not binary, because if you actually look at the genres, music, these genres shade into what you think of as the really hard stuff that it just sounds like dudes screaming and like banging on a guitar, an electric guitar, versus the stuff that's kind of just, it's moving in that direction, but it still has a more typical rock sound to it. And I'm by no means some kind of like connoisseur of this. So I'm just speaking as a complete, ordinary Joe. But there is some of it that evokes emotions of like anger and strength, and that can be useful, especially when you're like working out or something. So one thing I will confess to listening to, well, I won't name any particular groups, but on Spotify there are some playlists, and it's like the only way I can describe it is like Viking metal. Okay, so there are these. It incorporates some what I take would be like traditional Icelandic or Scandinavian instrumentation. It's like skin drums and these weird little pipe things that kind of, they sound ancient, right? They sound Viking, with like somebody chanting in some like Old Norse perhaps, and then it's just this sort of music, and it's like war music, and you hear these guys kind of going like, rah, it's almost like 300 or something, right? And that'll really get you going in the gym, right? It's like we are going.
I could just picture you in like the bat cave in your house. You have like a set gym room, just getting absolutely yoked to the Viking music.
Yes,
Shane.
We're going to battle, and that sort of thing definitely has its use, because it's been used in warfare forever, right? That sort of thing, war chants and marching songs. So So the boundaries are unclear to me exactly. And I would be very hesitant to condemn anybody's taste or say that's not music. I think there's a boundary somewhere, but I'm not exactly sure where to draw it. So that's a question for further, discussion.
I mean, my opinion is that anchored in the non-negotiables of reality, things like math, things like, to me, the existence of God. Like, I'll never be less than a theist. Like, our faith, by definition, is falsifiable. That's part of its greatness. Like the Apostle Paul says, if Christ isn't raised, everything's meaningless. So I don't know how this scenario happens, but like, let's say someone incontrovertibly found evidence of Jesus's body or something. That would disprove our faith. But that's a strength of our faith. It's actually meant to be very falsifiable and therefore trustworthy in that sense. There's an evidence test, right? But I don't know. To me, I can't go less than theism, no matter what else were to ever happen. So there are givens. I think there are non-negotiables of life. But I just think within those non-negotiables, God is pleased to allow an insane diversity of aesthetic choices. And to me, when I read Revelation and the nations bring their wealth into the New Jerusalem, that's where we harmonize. We need all 4 chapters: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And to me, restoration is every tribe, nation, and tongue bringing its particularness into the universal that is the New Jerusalem. And I think that's going to include all sorts of like crazy atonal music, ancient Greek stuff that we're like, well, that's weird. But like, when you travel overseas, you get a taste of that. Like even in Israel just now, I was listening to these Hebrew rappers at the Dead Sea being blasted over this like mixed drinks bar on the side of the Dead Sea. It was so wild. Like, I was like, I'm Shazamming so many of these songs just because it's so different to me. But like, there's something great about that. So, but I think that fits in Dr. Begbie's thesis. But there's that tension there. You know what I mean? There's the absolute and there's the subjective. There's the universal and the particular. And music feels so far on the subjective side. But I think one conclusion, Shane, that I completely agree with you on is that it's not completely subjective. Scraping nails over a chalkboard is not going to be, it's just not going to hit the same as like other forms of music.
Well, I mean, you've got that noise element, but there are symbolic appropriations of noise within music that can communicate something. So we talked about Howard Shore's score for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And there are, moments of just transcendent beauty. And apologies if you hear the thunder in the background here. I know that this thunderstorm that's going on right now outside is going to make it into the podcast. So that's just going to happen. But there are elements of, I guess, cacophony, we could call it, or noise, as Screwtape talks about it, that can be used to communicate something in music. And Howard Shore uses that actually to communicate the essence of evil. So in the theme for Isengard, you hear like chains jangling and you hear like metal clanging. So the percussion side of things is super rich and interesting in that, but it evokes this sort of like slavery, industry, destruction of the natural world that Saruman is all about, right? The Mordor theme kind of does the same thing. Whereas you get the elves and it's this beautiful like vocal work that's done there and very subtle instrumentation, very fine. It's evocative of holiness, really. And that's what that whole score, that's why it gives it so much life. But he's using a range of symbolic markers within the music to actually make a point. And that all serves a grand purpose. And I wouldn't say at all we should foreclose those elements that are evocative of something dark and sinister, because that's part of the story, right? And music tells a story. So that's where I would go for it. That's where I would go to make that point, is something like that beautiful grand work of art that like is playing in the background of this amazing movie trilogy. And also, Kasey, I should say this with regard to the all the nations bringing their treasures into the New Jerusalem. I totally agree with that. And I tend to look at it as from a historical perspective and note the fact that Europe, which broadly speaking is what we're referring to when we say Western music, right? Most of it developed within the bounds of what we call Europe and the Mediterranean. And this is where Christian influence for the past 2,000 years has been concentrated. It's just now within the last couple of centuries beginning to spill out into the whole world through missionary activities, and other continents are becoming Christianized. And what you see happening there, I think, is the native patrimony of the West, what we call the West, Europe and the Mediterranean, being sanctified and built up and advanced through through the influence of Christian theology. Because again, Christianity is the restoration of the true story of reality by the true Lord of reality, who stepped into it. And where did he step into? He stepped into the Mediterranean world, right? The Roman world. So of course it's going to affect that first. But as Christianity moves out, it's going to have that same sanctifying, leavening effect. We could use Jesus' metaphor of the leaven working through the whole loaf, the whole lump of dough elsewhere. So all of the native patrimony of the rest of the world, things that are distinctive and quite different from the Western art and music and culture that was sanctified by Christianity, those things are going to be sanctified too. And as the centuries unfold, who knows what will come out of the East? Who knows what will come out of South America and Africa? These things will be, beautified by Christianity. I strongly believe in this principle that no good thing will ultimately come to nothing. That all good things will be preserved and brought up into God's new world, and that those treasures will find their true end in Christianity. I think we're already beginning to see so much of that.
Right. And so one question is like, so what? Right. And I think the so what that our listeners and ourselves, Shane, you and me, even as we do this kind of commentary work that we're in, the so what should not be to elevate Western music as superior just because it's Western. I think we elevate the cross because it's true. And we marvel at how it took actually a deeply corrupt culture in many ways and transformed it. And also that should give us some humility because as non-moral relativists, we can definitively say not everything about the West is good. So yeah, I mean, I was going to say this on the Tolkien. It's such a side note, but as a fan of Wagner, I think we can definitively say Tolkien would have loved Howard Shore's soundtrack.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's probably the only thing about that trilogy that he would have unabashedly endorsed.
Oh, hot takes. We're gonna need a whole.
I love the trilogy, but I'm just saying Tolkien was he was hard to please. Let's just put it that way. We know very that true. For sure. I mean, he didn't even like Narnia, for goodness sake. So that's a tough one. Yeah.
So to me, it's like art to me is anchored to intentionality. Because we are all creations of intellect and of the mind behind the universe. Like God is intentional and he created us, Imago Dei, to do intentional things. We're not robots. It's also anchored to morality. Like there is good and evil. And just like in the real world, morality takes on different flavors, but there is right and there is wrong. Like it is right to grieve sometimes. And it is right to rage against injustice sometimes in defense of metal music, which I don't listen to quite as much. But I would say that to 8th grade me. I'd be like, actually, it's, your angsty self. Like there's an aspect of it which is right to be angry about some things. And also, dude, just like chill. Like you're going to make it through maybe, whatever. Just stop trying to be a skater when you can't actually ride the skateboard, whatever. Everyone goes through that phase. Yeah, it's anchored to universals, but the expression of it is allowed within, because it's anchored to those universals, a huge, breathtaking variety. To me, that's the takeaway.
Yeah. Kasey, there's so much more to talk about here because this is rich material. My conversation with Dr. Begbie barely scratched the surface. His books are just marvelous. Some of them are, I would say, very on the academic side, so they're going to be hard work to get through. But the points he's making can be digested very simply by just going on YouTube, looking up Jeremy Begbie. Anyone who's curious to know more can look up some of his talks he's given over the years. With Duke Divinity in particular has hosted a lot of really interesting stuff. And he's talked about music and theology. And he demonstrates the interrelation between these two things and the kinds of lessons. What really fascinates me, Kasey, is the lessons that he brings out. And this thunderstorm right here is going nuts right now. So I know everyone can hear it, but the lessons that he brings out from music itself and the way it can help us to understand theology in a way that the visual metaphors in particular don't, the way those kinds of things can mislead us. Music can speak into theological concepts in a way that a lot of other areas of life and art and aesthetics can't. And so we should mine those riches while remaining moored carefully to the word of God, right? And the non-negotiables there, but be open to the wisdom that we can receive through beauty itself, because the gospel is beautiful and God is beautiful, and Jesus Christ revealed as the Son of God and the Son of Man is beautiful. And God is a musical God. He loves it. He's written quite a bit of music himself and inspired quite a bit. So I love the conversation, and I highly encourage people to check more of Dr. Begbie's work out. Kasey, thanks again for joining me. I look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Shane. And I'll just say the thunderstorm has made this kind of an ASMR experience for me. Like, it's very soothing.
Yes.
You know, it's like we're just having a porch chat about music at the Morris residence as Florida is battered by gale force wind. So,
it's amazing, dude. This is, speaking of sound experiences, you know, the part of what I love about the natural world is that it has so many beautiful sounds in and of itself. And we take that and we work through that with our own music. But boy, there's nothing that enchants me quite like these summer thunderstorms in Florida have always enchanted me. It's like those afternoons where the thunder just rolls in and the rain comes down in sheets and just rumbles against the roof like it's doing right now. Man, it is beautiful, and it will put you to sleep. I'm telling you what.
So good. Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.